This morning we have Mark Finney who will be speaking to us. Mark is a familiar face to many of you. He's a professor of mass communication at Emory and Henry College. He and Aaron and Annabelle moved here from Colorado in 2013, and we're so glad that they've joined us here at the church. So, Mark.
Morning.
Good morning.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I guess I should concede to start with that I've found it sort of difficult to get this talk rolling. Actually, in the last 2 weeks, I've contemplated changing the topic a dozen times, and I haven't done so. But, you know, we've had sort of a week at Emory and Henry, and it's been sort of hard not to just scrap the whole food holidays thing and talk about what's going on there. But I'm going to talk about food holidays instead. The other thing is that, you know, this is a topic that felt really self-evident to me because this is how we celebrate in my family. We celebrate the food holidays, and I thought that that would be really easy to convey. But as I began to think about it, I realized that it was really maybe more difficult than I thought it would be to convey that to y'all. And also, I was really struggling to understand what Meg Barnhouse called the truth here, right? What's the truth here of the food holidays, and, you know, how can I relay that? The thing is, I spend like 90% of my oratory energy on thinking. As a college professor, I'm constantly trying to get my students to think, to use empirical methods of observation, to evaluate ideas, not on the basis of like what they feel, but what the merits of the argument, the merits of the evidence. But the thing is, what I really like most is about coming to the UU is when I get to feel instead of think. When I can let my brain sort of drift for a while and enjoy the energy in the room or the way that the ideas feel to me before we get back in the car, and, you know, then we can talk about the merits of the argument. Last week, for instance, I found myself just sort of feeling the idea, you are God. Right? You know, without thinking about it, without wondering whether it's something that could be proven or challenged. It felt good to me. It felt like an empowerment, an affirmation. It felt like for a few minutes there, I could sort of forget about justifying every last decision that I make at work, every statement that I make to students, all of that stuff. That felt really good. So you're going to find here today that this is a talk without much reason. I'm specifically not citing sources, although having said that, I instantly regret the decision. I'm going to stick with that decision. I'm not going to analyze the Last Supper, and I'm not going to talk about breaking bread. I'm not going to describe the emotional or motivational changes that take place when conflicting parties sit down and eat with each other. I won't be referring to religious or sociologist, you know, scholarship who have contemplated the sharing of food. Instead, I'm going to talk today about instead I've planned a talk today that is oriented towards feeling instead of thinking. And as it turns out, that's difficult for me to write. So I'm going to tell you a few stories, and then I'm going to see if I can make this all make sense towards the end. We'll see how it goes. So to start, I want to tell you that I have what I have always called a food philosophy. It's actually more pragmatic than it is philosophical, but when I tell people about it, I always tell them that it's a food philosophy, and that's probably because it sounds better than a food pragmatism, whatever. And here it is. If I have an opportunity to try some food and I don't know what it is, I should eat it. Okay? Note that I'm saying food. I'm not saying that I'll eat anything that comes in, that I encounter, right? So rather, I've decided years ago that I was going to just try to eat just about everything that I could at least once, because, you know, sometimes you have something and you have to try it a couple of times because you want to make sure that it's not just gross because it was poorly prepared. And most of the time that this has worked really well for me, right? I've eaten some really interesting and wonderful foods using this philosophy, right? I can tell you that Rocky Mountain oysters are tasty with cocktail sauce, but they're alone, they're a little bit bland. I also have some difficulty overcoming the mental image associated with them. Alligator is awesome. Ramps and morels are wonderful. I can also tell you that the cheeks and the eyeballs of a whole roasted pig are just about the best thing that I have ever eaten, but that pig brain is not for me. I've also been burned by this approach on a couple of occasions. I can tell you that tripe is a thing that goes by many names, and I dislike almost all of them. I made this decision mostly out of adventurism. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm a pretty adventurous eater. I like spicy, I like sour, I like umami. I try to taste foods carefully, right? I try to exercise my senses of taste and smell. And while I've tried really hard to do so, I can only take half the credit for the fact that Annabelle is also a pretty adventurous eater. Her favorite food is escargot. I'm not kidding. Last year on our anniversary, the sitter fell through and we found ourselves at the tavern with Annabelle, who was a little cranky. And I saw escargot on the menu and I very quickly ordered that. And after that arrived, we had a really nice evening. But I digress, obviously, because this has nothing to do with holidays, right? How on earth am I going to connect all of this into something that's worth hearing about in church, right? Well, part of my adventurous spirit with regards to foods comes from my sense that people are generally good and that they're mostly interested in helping and making other people happy. And if they enjoy food like I do, then I ought to give their foods a go. My food philosophy, in addition to being about making myself happy, is also about developing my cultural competency and attempting to try something or to try to wear someone else's shoes, so to speak, for a meal or two. But more apropos, this falls on the day after Emory and Henry held its second ever Passover Seder, which was last night, and right in the middle of the Passover holiday. Last year's first ever Emory and Henry Passover Seder was attended by something like 50 people, including my parents, who brought wine and gefilte fish, which they did again last night, although someone made homemade gefilte fish last night, which was pretty special. And that we celebrate Passover on campus is actually more meaningful to me than I anticipated that it would be. As a part-time Jew, I never really thought about what it would be to work on a religiously affiliated campus until I did so. Emory and Henry is Methodist affiliated. And I have to say for now that, I wear my Jewishness on campus more than I ever have before. Not so much like an armor, but like a concert t-shirt, right? It's something that's special that I want, to show other people, right? I want them to be able to keep in mind that, that we're not all the same, right? That we don't all engage with the institution and the community through the same perceptible lenses. That the difference exists, right, and that it matters. And that's something that I see our students sort of struggling with sometimes. So Passover is the Jewish celebration of their freedom from the Pharaoh and from slavery in Egypt in 1313 BCE, right? It is specifically a food holiday because while it's certainly a ritualistic prayer ceremony, the food that is eaten at Passover is symbolic. We eat bitter herbs to remind ourselves of the hardships that the Jews faced as slaves. We eat matzah instead of bread to symbolize the haste with which Jews fled Egypt and the inability in those circumstances to wait for the dough to rise. We drink wine to commemorate our contemporary freedom from oppression. Each Passover, the story is told, like the whole Passover story gets told every year when we do this. The prayers are said, the foods are eaten in reverence and in the proper order. And in my house, as I suspect is the case in just about every other Jewish household, we think about those who have been lost over time, friends and family, victims of the Holocaust, other people who have been oppressed. The ceremony concludes with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem," which is sort of a reminder of the worldwide family of Jews. I'm not a scholar of the Talmud by any means, right? So when I tell you that in many ways, Passover embodies both the spiritual and familial feelings that I'm hoping to convey to you today, I hope you'll hear this as my interpretation rather than some sort of authoritative voice. My family has never celebrated Passover in Jerusalem. In fact, one might say that my family barely celebrates Passover at all. My mom is the only one who has learned Hebrew well enough to be able to pronounce the prayers, and none of us read Hebrew, right? Instead, Passover for the Finneys is a food holiday, an opportunity to share a carefully crafted meal, to sit around a table with as many of us who can make it, and to feel the love that we share for one another. The fact that the foods are symbolic is sort of a bonus. It forces our attention on the religiousness of the holiday, on thinking about the things that the rabbi tells us are important. My parents, it should be noted, who are right over there, are not of the same faith, right? My mom is Jewish, my dad is Methodist. Actually, I shouldn't say that. My mom's parents are Jewish, my dad's parents are Methodist. We are, an interfaith family. According to family lore, they married in my grandparents' living room to prevent a fight over whose holy space would be blessed with their nuptials. Aaron and I got married by the dean of the journalism school on the quad in front of the library at the University of Colorado. So we have a long tradition of secularism in my family, right? But due to the nature of the American holiday calendar, we find ourselves routinely spending time with each other around the Judeo-Christian holidays. Actually, the Christian holidays more than the Judeo-Christian holidays. And it isn't the holiday per se that draws us together, it's the opportunity to spend time with one another, right? It's that we get a couple of days off, and so that's what brings us together most of the time. So, it's like Christmas time, and the Christians are celebrating the birth of Christ, and the Finneys have gotten together as well. So what do? We cook. But it's never really that simple, because before we can cook, we have to plan. Months ahead of the holiday, literally months ahead of the holiday, my mom will send an email asking everyone what they're going to cook, right? And then each of us is responsible for making some contribution to the food holiday meal, and we have to choose something different. As a side note, we practice this in restaurants too. Each of us is confined to the solemn yet frequently unspoken agreement that we will all order something different off the menu so that we can pass our plates around and everybody can have a chance to share as many things as possible, right? So everybody chooses a dish to make months ahead of time. We all send the ingredients of that list to my parents, right? And then groceries are purchased, which is sort of an event in and of itself, because some of us prefer organic ingredients, other of us prefer inexpensive ingredients, some of us love to grocery shop, while others prefer not to grocery shop, right? Grocery trips in my family are frequent and lengthy. Kitchen time and equipment is reserved, right? And in this very special way, we express our love for one another. How then does this connect with spirituality? I think it's clear that our celebrations of food are expressions of love. And I think it's also worth noting that we end up honoring the traditions of the celebration too, though not in any sort of comprehensive way, right? When we employ a sort of religious pastiche to our food selections, in which we adopt some of the choicest foods to incorporate into our celebration, right? We always do a Passover Seder. There's always a turkey at Thanksgiving. Easter and Christmas usually involves fowl because Aaron doesn't eat pork. There's always candy at Halloween, right? We're honoring little bits of that spiritual tradition in the way that we adapt it essentially to our own. Okay, I have one citation, and it's only because it's a good quote. I don't actually know who the author is, but I really like the way that she said this. Her name is Shauna Nyquist, and she says, "I think preparing food and feeding people brings nourishment not only to our bodies, but to our spirits. Feeding people is a way of loving them, in the same way that feeding ourselves is a way of honoring our own createdness and fragility." My sister, I'm sorry, this is me again, I'm end quoting. My sister says that our food celebrations make her feel blessed, although in our discussion about this, she quickly changed the word blessed to fortunate because she wanted to avoid the religious connotation. She explained that it's fortunate that we can spend time together at a table, gadget-free and engaged with each other's lives, that we can frantically dance, sometimes for hours around the kitchen, with each other, without stepping on each other's toes too much or destroying each other's dishes, that we're able to take the time and to spend the money to travel the distances required to be with each other, and that we enjoy each other enough to make the commitment to do so, right? That's all fortunate or blessedness to her. To put it in Nyquist terms, food holidays are about expressing love to ourselves and to each other. By showing our love to each other, we also nourish our own souls. By thinking about and preparing food with the goal of sharing, we're also engaging in self-care. And like religious celebrations, there is a ritualistic nature to our process of food preparation and consumption, and also a meditative quality to it as well. Cooking, defined as the repetition of acts in a prescribed order, That's ritual, right? That's the definition of ritual. Religions think of ritual as a spiritual practice, and I'd agree that we are engaged in some sort of spiritual ritualism around food preparation and consumption. Aaron, who married into this family, I'm sure would agree that there's a ritualistic practice to the consumption and production of food in our families. At the same time, our presentness to the moment, the contemplative attention to serving each other and preparing food for fools, that feels meditative to me. Sorry, I did not write that they're fools. That was Freud. So I referred in the beginning of this talk to the video we saw a few weeks ago with Meg Barnhouse, who asked herself to be mindful of what the truth here is. And I have to say, in retrospect, I think that I may have misunderstood her. As I read my notes and as I sort of stand here talking to you, reading them to you, I find that many of the words that I've written have been some sort of a wild attempt to persuade you to the idea that the Finney food holiday is somehow a spiritual equivalent to the spirituality of the world's religions. And I think I've provided some interesting evidence on that score, right? But as I prepare to wrap things up, I've come to maybe a different realization, that there's not really a need for equivalency. I don't need to justify my spiritual practice because the justification lies within me. And that's what's really important, I think. I love our food holidays. I relish the email from Mom prompting me and Aaron to start thinking about, what we're going to make, how our dishes will fit or not fit with each other and with everybody else's. I love searching my brain in the books and the internet each time to find a dish that's appropriate and which I hope will be delicious. I love that Aaron doesn't eat pork, that Grandpa loved raw onions, and Annabelle hasn't learned yet to eat spicy foods. I also love that Leisha's obsession with meticulously prepared coffee, Leisha's my sister, by the way, that her obsession with meticulously prepared coffee is obsessive. It falls on each of us to consider each other's tastes each time that we plan a dish. I don't love that it cost Leisha a ton to get out here from Oakland for the major holidays, but I'm really truly grateful for her willingness to do so over and over and over again, in spite of what a pain flying has become. And I love cooking. I love the interaction of ingredients and flavors, the tricks that I've learned to get food to taste the way that I want it to. I love sharing food that I've cooked with others and that feeling of anxiety that happens when strangers eat something that I've made, right? Did I do it well enough this time? What have I done different? What could I have done better? Will they like it? And to that end, I want to invite you all to share in some food with us during the coffee and conversation time. In honor of the season of Passover, we have made matzo ball soup, which is a good Jewish dish, right? I don't have a recipe for matzo ball soup, or more precisely, I don't have a recipe for the chicken stock, right? It's something that I've learned through observation and repetition and frantic phone calls with my mother over the years. Our chicken stock is made with a whole chicken. It's boiled down for hours with onions and celery and spices. It chills for at least overnight so the fat can be skimmed off before reheating. Matzo balls are made of matzo meal, which is like a flour. There's eggs and salt and broth. We add the balls to the boiling stock. We added the balls to the boiling stock before church started, and by the time that we're done here today, they should all be ready. They will all be ready, actually. One of the things that we always ask ourselves when we eat matzo ball soup is whether the balls are floaters or sinkers. It has to do with their density, right? My mother claims to know how to make them floaters or sinkers. I don't think that she does. I don't think anybody does. I think it's sort of one of God's mysteries to figure out, So we do have a vegetarian version, although the matzo balls all have eggs in them, just for the record. So I guess none of it is really vegetarian, but there's a vegetarian broth. If you're at all inclined to eat meat, I recommend the version with the chicken stock because it's authentic, right? That's the kind of thing that, the Shankins, which is my mother's maiden name, have been making for generations. I think that both are delicious, though. Don't get me wrong. So I hope this hasn't been too much schmaltz for y'all today. Thank you very much.